80% of employment among neurodiverse people. And Ro is going to share with you some of the things that impact that number, where that just the way we write job postings sometimes can be very discouraging or turn off a potential applicant who may be neurodiverse. And then the World Health Organization came out with this statistic that 18% more employees in the workplace are disciplined for performance. Neurodivergent individuals in the workplace are disciplined for performance. And we'll share some examples of how that has shown up even with the groups that we work with, where supervisors or managers who may not have been well trained or who may not be aware identify something as a performance issue, when in fact it may be due to neurodiversity, and perhaps some other interventions could have taken place that would have helped that particular situation. There's some interesting stats too, and teams with neurodiversity report 30% more productivity than those without. We do know, even from the own diversity, equity, and inclusion work that we do, we have organizations at all levels of their journey or all spaces of their journey. Only 22% indicate that they're expert or in advanced stages. So when we think about the work that we do, a lot of organizations that are doing general diversity training. We have a few that have actually specifically asked for training in neurodiversity, but it's one of those areas that people are not always comfortable or ready to dive right into. And then we also know that companies that practice flexibility and inflexibility have degree of success with the neurodiverse. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by inflexibility, but some neurodiverse conditions, people feel more comfortable when there is routine and predictability in what they're going to be doing during the day. So when we think about what just happened with the pandemic and how disruptive that was, some employees do better naturally in working remotely, and others may find that a disruption or may find it a positive. I want to note here that you see a lot of large for-profit organizations here that have neurodiversity programs within their inclusion and diversity programs. What they do can be applied in another scale at any organization, regardless of whether it's a for-profit, a nonprofit, a large organization, or a small organization. So we hope that as you leave today, you think about one or two actions that you can take in your organization, or share one or two things that you're doing that we can share with the group to make your workplace more inclusive. So there are a lot of positive impacts of neurodiversity in the workplace. A number of different reports indicate that there's increased creativity and innovation. When you have people who think differently and see things different ways, that's where true innovation is inspired. I often think about, if you remember I might be dating myself, but Apple did a campaign, I don't know, in the last several years that featured great minds of the past, and arguably some of these people had differences, whether they were diagnosed differences or not. But one very famous person was Albert Einstein, and their whole slogan was thinking differently, and that's what led to the success of that organization. Sometimes we think about neurodiversity too, and it's in people will work in technology organizations, but it doesn't just have to be a technology organization. There's a place in every organization. Flexibility and adaptability, coming up with creative solutions. If we can only listen and allow that voice to be heard, we may learn something differently. We see reports of enhanced team performance, more balanced. Many of the neurodiverse professionals have superpowers that perhaps a neurotypical individual may not have, and that could be enhanced listening, that could be enhanced analysis, it could be spotting patterns that perhaps someone else may not see. So there are so many enhancements to a team. Increased productivity. We see reports of neurodiverse professionals having higher levels of concentration given the right conditions, the right circumstances. And there's a lot of data that supports that the embracing neurodiversity as part of your inclusion program creates that work environment where people feel more valued. So that certainly is benefits to your organization. And I love this quote. I think that it's just important to think about there's no one right way of thinking, learning, or behaving, and the differences should not be viewed as deficits. So as we think about this and we enter into, so now what can you actually do to enable the success of neurodivergent professionals in the workplace? I'd love to turn it over to Ro to lead off our conversation.
Thank you, Allison. So we're really going to focus on these 4 key areas around our HR practices, how we can adjust physical space in the workplace to ensure our colleagues that have neurodivergent conditions are comfortable and more productive and feel, seen in the workplace. We're really going to spend some time on communication and training, because those are the key fundamentals where in my direct experience in this work, I've seen a lot of the challenges. It comes through lines of communication, and training would definitely help alleviate that. So let's get started with some of the HR practices. So when we look at what we're examining, let's start with the recruitment process. Now, this is not just, taking a stab at adjusting our practices for recruitment only. This should be a full employment cycle for an individual. But, the employment cycle starts with recruitment. How are we advertising roles? How are we advertising opportunities? I recommend reviewing the language in the job descriptions and job postings. A lot of times we use a lot of jargon phrases, multitasking, fast paced. That could be very discouraging to someone who is neurodivergent, because, think about that individual who likes the routine and the focus. If you're telling them as soon as you start an opportunity, it's multitasking, it's going to automatically be like, nope, that's not for me. I probably wouldn't be successful. And we really want to take some time to rethink some of the roles through a non-traditional lens. Assess the skill sets, assess the experience that's really needed to be successful in the role, and not just what we conceive the role to be. Because there's a different way of doing things. There's a different approach that may be successful, and really taking the time to engage in the interview process with a person, and realizing that maybe some of the interview and assessment tools that we're leveraging are not ideal. So what's been found to be successful is very informal conversation with clear expectations and the needs of the role, so that someone can share, be it neurodiverse or neurotypical. Just general conversation is a great way to get to know someone, because it lessens that anxiety that can happen in interviews, and we've all been there. But then once you establish what those skill sets are and the experience, think about the add that that individual will bring to your organization. A lot of times we recruit for what we deem a cultural fit, but I challenge us all to kind of work towards a cultural add to organizations. What different perspective or abilities can someone bring to our team to broaden our team's success and make an impact on the organizational success? My favorite here is developing an onboarding ecosystem. When I think, and Allison, please correct me, I think it was MasterCard that uses the ecosystem, which is pairing a neurodiverse and a neurotypical employees together through their onboarding process for probably the first year or so of employment, so they can engage and learn from each other through the onboarding process. So expectations in the workplace, communication, how things are perceived, how things are literal, the partnership between individuals in the workplace to give support is definitely going to be something that's going to make it much more neurodiverse friendly in the workplace.
And Ro, I just want to add something to the interview. We have a number of organizations that do panel interviews or do back-to-back interviews with candidates that they're seriously considering. Rethink that, because that can be, Ro mentioned how stressful it can be, but sometimes the pace at which we we conduct interviews and multiple interviews, we may want to think about spreading that out or creating a different environment where someone feels more comfortable.
Agreed.
And, I think if we think about the physical space, I hearken back to when the workplace architects went from moving from the traditional office and cubicle environment to an open space environment. Even then, I remember thinking, wow, for some people, this is going to be really challenging. And even our own organization went through that. And you could see some people struggled with it a little bit more than others. So when you think about neurodiversity and sensory issues or responses to loud noises or challenges concentrating when you're hearing multiple conversations, we have to be intentional about creating environments where people have a space to go if they need to focus or need to just kind of decompress a little bit. Hoteling is a big thing now, particularly post-pandemic, where people are downsizing office space. But perhaps we're not saying don't do hoteling, but perhaps you have hoteling spots that can be individuals who are requesting the same hotel spot just for that sense of routine or comfort. Mm-hmm. You could make that available to them. Offering a quiet space. Many organizations do that even when they move to open space, having an office where they can step back. Some of the groups that have really had intentional programs around attracting neurodiverse have break rooms or rest areas or places where people who have sense or sleep issues and timing issues, their circadian clock is different, right? And they get tired during the day because they are awake and active in the evening. They have a place where they can go and just turn the lights down and be quiet. Tactile, think about uniforms. If any of your organizations require people to wear uniforms, some neurodiverse individuals have just tactile sensory issues where certain fabrics or certain things that fit a certain way may be very distracting for them. So allowing for modifications in uniforms could be helpful. And then just movements, allowing, the people for breaks, flexible seating. We do see that in modern workplaces today, places where people can stand, standing desks, other areas, but I think that continues to be important. And flexibility will be important. Flexibility in where they work, how they work, when they work will continue to be important. Ro, anything else that you've seen with the employers you work with regards to physical space?
It's just a lot about making sure that people have that span to move around. I have a client that has a couple of individuals that have ADHD and they like to constantly move, but giving them the autonomy to move around and relocate when necessary is very helpful. And the point that you allowed there for the fidget toys, they're very calming for some individuals, just to kind of have that constant touch point in hand. And some people use clicking pens, but just to have things readily available for individuals is most definitely helpful.
And those are things where, you have to be mindful for the impact that a clicking tool may have on somebody else. So you have to think about what the impact of this would have, and how do you physically space people or allow people to be able to do what's going to make them most productive and make them feel comfortable in the workplace. And of course, communication. Ro does a lot of work in both individual and group communication, coaching and training. So I'm curious to hear your insights here.
My insights here are, the first point is exactly what I mean. Use clear communication styles. A lot of times in the workplace, we use implied language, suggestive language, where we're trying to give people freedom to make choices on their own. In terms of working with individuals with neurodivergent conditions, we want to be very direct. We want to be very matter of fact. A lot of times things get lost in interpretation because we're using, some sarcasm, or, we'll say like, what, I'll be back in 5. Well, that individual may be looking for you to be back in 5, and take it literally. And sometimes that can cause breakdowns in communication. Providing clear and concise instructions is very helpful. Checklists I have found to be very impactful, with helping create routine for individuals to keep them on task and on focus. I literally helped a executive director create a checklist for an employee so that they will go through the same routines at the start of their day to kind of get set for all of the unplanned things that would happen throughout the day, and that end of the day routine to help them kind of make sure all of their action items are taken care of, because they couldn't handle the constant change and move, and things were starting to fall through the cracks. The thing that I've noticed and is very helpful, not only for the neurodivergent, but also the neurotypical, is giving advance notice when things are going to change. A lot of people right now are kind of built and wired with this routine of, okay, I'm going to do this on Monday, this on Tuesday, this on Wednesday. And when things change, it kind of just takes them completely off course. So in my experience, whenever there can be advance notice given of a change, make sure individuals know that as well in advance as possible, and let them know what's staying the same, and kind of clarifying what the difference is going to be. The other thing that is helpful is when we're preparing for meetings or things like that, if we can share agendas ahead of time, to make sure that, people understand what the focus of the conversation is going to be. And then also in meetings, making sure that we manage the communication so that there's not a lot of multiple overtalk, which can be overload for some individuals. And they may not be able to contribute to that conversation because they're not sure how to navigate getting in and out of the conversation and sharing. All in all, it's really about being kind, being patient, and really thinking about possibilities before we jump to conclusions. A lot of times people are experiencing, and Allison spoke to this earlier, that there's a lot of complaints of bullying and harassment, and a lot of it stems from how we communicate in the workplace. So if, there's conversation happening on the sides of the office and people are calling individuals weird or different, or excluding them from activities, that can really isolate a person and make them feel like they really cannot be part of the team. And we want to make sure that we're advising all of our employees to be mindful of the things we do and say, and bring awareness to neurodiversity in the workplace. Being kind and being patient is something that I live by. It is something that Exude lives by. It's who we are as an organization, and we want to make sure that people understand the impact of words can be harmful to working relationships when not monitored or addressed appropriately.
Yeah, and I want to add two things to what you just said.
Mhm.
I'll start with the last one, which is, people's life experiences, we all know, are very different. I happen to have a number of neurodiversity in my extended family, so I've had exposure, and even through work colleagues throughout the years. Some individuals may not have had that exposure, and may not have that awareness. So I think being clear about raising awareness, and emphasizing how we're going to communicate with people regardless of the individual is really important. And then the other thing I just wanted to say, our business practices, think about our standard business practice, pull everybody in for a brainstorming session, and let's just throw ideas on the board. That can be incredibly overwhelming, and we're not saying don't do that. What we're saying is, to Rose's point, put in some other pieces that will allow someone who doesn't thrive or may not contribute in that environment with options. So maybe for meetings, there's a post-meeting board where you can add additional ideas after the meeting. That might give someone the quiet time that they need to focus and be able to contribute. So, I think some of the HR process changes here don't have to be monumental. They're incremental tweaks that you can make to make it more inclusive.
So training is by far, and Allison can probably speak to this, one of my favorite things to do with Exude is to just offer training. Training in this component is really about that soft skills training for not only neurotypical employees, but neurodivergent. Sometimes because of the socialization impact that neurodivergence can have, we need to make sure that we are training our staff across the board on the soft skills in terms of conflict resolution, performance management, how we engage with one another, because a lot of times there are opportunities where what's perceived to be rude is just someone's different socialization level. And we want to make sure that people are aware of what that may look like and how to engage with each other in the workplace. Unconscious bias and allyship and communication skills, hands down, were going to be instrumental in making sure that the inclusive work culture and environment is maintained and sustained for organizations. Because once we know better, we do better. And the challenge is right now, a lot of us are not aware of how neurodiversity is impacting us in the workplace, and we're not sure how to navigate that space. So the best way to combat that is to have training, to have the conversations, to open up the dialogue, and really engage with each other and make sure that we're equipped. Our managers are equipped, all of our staff members are equipped and aware of how neurodivergency can bring an added value to the organization, and how to engage and create an environment where everyone can feel comfortable is most important. Just taking a look through the Q&A, and I think we're going to get to the Q&As probably at the tail end of the presentation, but we will address the questions that are listed there. I see some that are coming through. Allison, is there anything that you wanted to add around the training component?
I just think that when you think about training, there's formal training, there's informal training, there are short sound bites where you can take one of these topics and speak about it, or just raise awareness or share articles. So think creatively. Not everybody has a robust budget for training, but there always are things you can do to raise awareness, whether it's listening to a podcast. There's some fantastic podcasts about neurodiversity in the workplace that you could even just do a lunch and learn where people listen to that podcast and then you talk about those things. I do think the unconscious bias for hiring managers is critical. And not just hiring managers, I mean, any supervisors, so that they're made aware that they can pause and reflect on what's happening before judging or responding. I saw somebody posted in the Q&A that, there's shame for someone who's neurodiverse. There could be shame in applying because you don't know if you're going to fit in, and that's terrible. You don't want that for anyone. You don't want that for your child, your friend, your loved one, anyone. So what can we do to kind of open people's minds and expand their perceptions of neurodiversity in the workplace? Again, and same with allyship. How do we reach out? How do we proactively support individuals in the workplace so that they can be successful? I did see a couple of other ones here. Somebody questioned the 80% unemployment. It's 80% of the 20% of the population that falls into the neurodiverse category. Okay, so and we'll address some of these others as we move along. And Ro, I know we often bring this topic up in our programs around diversity, equity, inclusion, but I know that this is an area that you've got a lot of experience.
Mm-hmm. This emotional intelligence is by far the direct correlation of how we make this work. Because emotional intelligence is our ability to recognize and understand emotions within ourselves. So it's a lot of self-reflection. It's a lot of understanding the impact on our actions and words to those around us. and how we make decisions and solve problems and communicate with others. So the more we enhance our emotional intelligence and we gain the knowledge and we have the curiosity to learn about different different groups, it allows us to really be more aware of the impact of those around us. When we tap into our emotional intelligence, we're really thinking and having the self-reflection before jumping to conclusions. And a lot of times we're thinking something may be one thing and it's completely the opposite. I can give you a scenario. I had a client that had a performance issue with one of their top leaders, and they were not sure how or why this individual was not following through and making sure things happened. We came to learn that the individual has a neurodivergent condition, and when he didn't want to divulge that because he didn't trust the leader with that information. And when he opened up and really shared that context, we were able to find some tools and resources that allowed him to thrive in the workplace, actually resolving what was perceived as a performance issue, but was really a different way of processing information and responding to inquiries and things like that. The leader of this organization took a moment to self-reflect and examined how her interactions were kind of engaging with this person to make them very reluctant to come forth. So we want to make sure our emotional intelligence is so elevated that people can trust us with this information, because a lot of people do not want to divulge this because they don't want to be viewed as different. They don't want to be viewed as someone that has some type of deficit. And this is in no way, shape, or form a deficit. It's a different way of thinking, approaching, and learning ideas and tasks. So your emotional intelligence is going to be very important, because think about your current workforce, people that are working with you right now. Do they feel compelled to come and share with you that they have a neurodiversity, that they need an adjustment, that they may need an accommodation or things like that? Or are they just trying to kind of push through, keep their head down so that nobody knows what they're going through on an individual level? So developing emotional intelligence is very instrumental in the work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it gives self-reflection on how we are engaging with those around us.
Mm. You remind me of another example that came up in a group that I was working with, that, it's a very heavy email organization.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an individual who they found out later had dyslexia and would prefer in-person meetings, or would go over to talk to people, or would pick up the phone and respond versus typing, because that required a lot of extra energy and effort. And there was fear or shame that if they sent something that didn't come through correctly, that they may be perceived differently too.
Mm-hmm.
And we even had that come up on and this was interesting. This is a learning for us, doing a town hall program, one of our DEI program, where people were able to chat. And this was in an institution of higher education. And we got feedback after the session from a particular individual saying, it made me very uncomfortable to share anything in writing with this group. Now, mind you, this is higher education, so there might even be or the perception that a typo or a grammatical error may be, or maybe a sign of a deficit. And that was good feedback for us. So we have to be mindful of that and set the tone at the beginning of a presentation, that it's okay. Whatever, you put your thought out there. It doesn't matter whether there's spelling. It doesn't matter. We just want to get the idea. So.
Right. So around awareness, a lot of times in neurodivergence, we've seen, and this is kind of our day-to-day engagements with clients, with employers, the processing of information. what we're sending to people sometimes can be overload. So manageable amounts of information at one time. If we spend all day between email and phone call and Slack and Teams and bouncing back between different platforms, that can be a lot. That can be overwhelming. And then allowing times for questions so that people can kind of unpack information and handle it in the amounts that's comfortable for them. It makes us as people leaders more intentional with how we're engaging. Socially awkward in social situations, sometimes small talk is not, and I've had this happen. And I've had employees come to me and ask, what do I do? I'm trying to make small talk and be, cordial to my colleagues. And they just kind of look at me and like, okay, so what do you need me to do? And it's not that the person's being rude. They're just not wired that way for social engagements. And that's fine. It's more about the directness. And sometimes we take directness as rudeness, and it's not. So just making sure that, if we see that there's a difference in the approach to engaging with someone in a social situation, don't jump to the conclusion that, the person's rude or they don't want to be there or they're dismissive. Take and think of it through the lens of someone who does not do well in social settings or has a different preferred social engagement style that may not be typical to that, making small talk, going to the office party, that may make a lot of people very uncomfortable. People taking things literally, that back in 5, there's someone expecting to see you back in 5 minutes. So when we say things, sometimes things are perceived just as the words are being said, not the message or the undertone or reading between the lines that can be perceived. Also knowing that face-to-face communication may be uncomfortable for individuals. The noise, the multiple conversations, we talked about the brainstorming sessions. Eye contact may make people feel a little uncomfortable. So just be mindful that if you're engaging with someone in person on camera and they may not necessarily continuously look at you, it's not a sign of disrespect. It could just be a socialization difference, or it could be a cultural difference as well. Sometimes looking people in the eye is not a culturally approved way of engaging. So we want to be mindful that our own experience is not the only experience that we have. We want to think, broader and wider as we engage with different populations. Allison?
I want to add something too. And if you go back to that second bullet there, we work with a lot of organizations that do team development or they have team sessions. If you're going to do those, be intentional about offering roles for activities that give people the option to do something kind of alone or individualized. So for someone who may not like a lot of stimulation, they can have a job. So just be intentional about assigning roles and letting the team decide. But it's sometimes we, go all in for team sessions and make an assumption that everybody's going to respond to a particular activity. Be intentional about designing the activities, or work with groups that are intentional about designing the activities to give everybody an opportunity to participate. And I think, Ro, you want to go, we talked about some of this. This is really more just recapping.
The communication considerations, those things again around meetings, sending agendas in advance, the managers meeting so that people don't all speak at once, giving space for people to contribute, be it in writing, be it privately, be it after a meeting. Post-meeting follow-up is very important because sometimes people cannot focus in the midst of all of the back and forth. but they may, once they get to a quiet place and can focus, have some really great insight and perspective to share, but affording, a follow-up period after meetings for sharing additional content or thoughts is very helpful. With individuals, using the non-literal language, understanding and reading body language is important. Sometimes what we think, again, is a staunch demeanor is just some person's way of managing social engagements. So again, I always err on the side of not jumping to a conclusion, taking time to ask the question, building the relationships, building the trust so that people are willing to kind of share. And again, practicing patience goes for everybody at this juncture as we all try to come back into a new normal, into the workspace. There's a lot of anxiety about coming back into the workplace and, engaging with people and making sure we're still saying the appropriate things or doing the appropriate things. So being patient with one another, we call it space for grace at Exude. We give each other space for grace. And we understand that people are human first and employees second, and giving people that range to just be their authentic self and having the desire to get to know them and understand them is going to be key in creating and maintaining that inclusive work environment.
Great. I think that before we go into kind of our summary and recap of everything, maybe we can take a look at some of these questions, Ro,
Sounds
and
good.
address some of those. We talked about the unemployment. We talked about shame. Yes, we will be sharing the PowerPoint presentation. So you'll see a link after this. Our colleague who is in Florida sends that out, so it may be a couple of days, but certainly if you need it before then, feel free to reach out to either one of us.
Mhm.
We have a question around job descriptions. If the culture is fast-paced and the job does require an ability to juggle different projects at a time, what words might you suggest? Ro, any thoughts on that one?
Let's see. I would suggest using the ability to tailor the work and prioritizing, working on multiple things at an individual pace. So making sure that people know that, being clear that the expectation is to be able to manage certain things, but giving the autonomy to do it in a way that's comfortable for that individual. So I would have to kind of think through some wordsmithing there, but I can afford a follow-up question. And Allison, I'll turn it to you if you have a recommendation in the moment.
Yeah, no, I like the idea of prioritizing tasks so that things, can be done. I think we know that there are jobs that require a lot of different things. I would challenge the group if anybody has a suggestion on what maybe you've done with one of your job descriptions to feel free to share, and we can include that in our follow-up to the session. There's a really a good question, and thank you for asking it, because I had meant to bring this up earlier. Some neurodiverse categories fall into the disability arena, and what triggers certain legal considerations. So I'm going to give you a real life example, and this is several years ago. I had an employee come to me to say, listen, I am going to start planning for a family, and I take medication for ADHD. And in order to do this, I have to come off my medication. And I know that I may show up differently. So we applied the, reasonable accommodation process by engaging in an interactive dialogue with that individual. She had already gotten in touch with through her doctor, was connected to a job coach. And so she had some suggestions to bring to the conversation. I think engaging in an interactive dialogue, if anyone's asking for a certain accommodation, or if there's enough information there that would suggest that you should engage in that conversation, you would want to do that. Certainly, many of these conditions do fall under Americans with Disabilities Act. Some people may not ever have been diagnosed, so they may not self-disclose that, nor do we want to openly ask someone. We would never do that about their medical condition. But if it is a performance issue, you can certainly engage in the conversation. Ro, tell me, and I've noticed over the last few weeks that you've had trouble completing reports on time or something. What can you share with me what's going on? Or is there anything we can be doing to remove any obstacles for you? So I hope that addresses that situation. Recommendations for self-awareness trainings. I do think that we can probably send some information, post that out with our follow-up. Is there a well-known test that one can take to see if one falls under neurodiverse? There's so many. I mean, we're not professionals in diagnosing neurodiversity. There are a number of different processes that can be used and assessments that can be used. Some organizations use behavioral assessments as part of the recruitment process, not as a decision maker in the recruitment process, but as a way of identifying areas where someone may need additional support. That's not exactly what this person is asking about. But I would check with your medical provider with regards to tests that diagnose neurodiverse categories. What tactic do you suggest to aid people in feeling comfortable sharing their neurodivergent needs? That's a great question.
That's a great question.
Ro, do you want to lead on that one?
Sure. It's just creating a safe, what we like to call a psychological safe space for someone to share, contribute, challenge, learn, making sure that you have the confidentiality with a person and the trust of a person to make them feel comfortable sharing that with you, letting them come to you. Again, we're not suggesting that you ever ask someone about a medical condition in any way, shape, or form, but literally letting the individuals know that there are support, there are resources that are available, and engaging in that conversation to find out what those needs are. Sometimes people may not know what they need, which is a major hurdle because, again, a lot of individuals are working in the workforce now that may have never been, given a diagnosis or a condition, or even understand. Sometimes they're, in my personal experience, having family members, they were never told that they had a condition. So they go through life thinking that the way that they operate is what is typical. And the question now becomes, what is really typical? There is no typical anymore. We all need to be appreciative of the differences that we have, but creating that safe space for someone to be able to share and have a trusting, confidential relationship with a direct supervisor or another leader in the organization to kind of speak to the needs that they have without them feeling shamed is definitely going to be impactful.
Yeah, I think normalizing the conversation around neurodiversity is another tactic you can use. And again, that goes to having people informal training, formal training, podcasts, discussions around neurodiversity in the workplace. We're talking about internal on this conversation, but think about the populations you serve, your clients, your customers, your guests, however you refer to that population. Because think about educating your internal staff to better service those you service, because they have neurodiversity as well. So normalizing the conversation both internally and externally is a good tactic to use to make someone feel comfortable about coming forward. I read a fantastic article. If I can find the link, I'll include it on the post follow-up, or if anybody wants to reach out to me, about an individual who was aware of he was on the spectrum. He was aware of his neurodiversity, and he was guided by a job coach in interviews to be able to start off the interview by saying, look, I may be the most awkward interview you ever have, but I can tell you I'm probably the best junior, I forget what his role was, computer programmer you'll ever meet. And I mean, that's an example of someone who had the right resources or was connected to the right resources to have the right coaching, and was very comfortable with their neurodivergent needs. Can we share the presentation recording with others? Absolutely. We hope you do. If there's someone you feel would benefit from some of the information we shared today, please share graciously. And someone indicated that they removed the language, the multi-task or multiple job language, but they focus on that item during the interview, which I think is a great tactic as well. Great. Okay. All right. So I think we have a few minutes remaining here. So how about we wrap it up just to recap some of the things that we spoke about. And again, anyone who wants any additional information or would like to connect with us, feel free to do so. Basically rethink your HR practices through the lens of what could we do more of, less of, or differently to make it more inclusive, to make people more comfortable sharing their particular needs, or to remove obstacles from someone who may be neurodivergent. Consider your physical space options. Think about that. I'd also suggest here, if you are in a hybrid or remote work environment, having a checklist that Ro talked about, a checklist on good practices working from home or working remotely may be really helpful from someone who gets easily distracted. Some people may just take it for granted. Of course, I'll figure that out. But when the pandemic first happened, we recommended that as kind of give people some guidelines for them to choose to use, how they choose to use it. Certainly communication, be mindful, do training for all staff, managers, and supervisors on how to effectively communicate and knowing when to alter their own style of communication to better connect with someone whose style may be different than theirs. Prepare the pilot's checklist. So that pilot's checklist that many of you may be familiar with, the amazing woman, American scientist, and I don't know if I'm going to pronounce her last name correctly, but it's Temple Grandin. She was the scientist who is on the spectrum and all her life continued to work through that. She actually created a more humane process for cattle to feel more comfortable going through the horrible, the whole stress of meatpacking plants. But her whole thing was thinking about what can we do differently to make people feel more comfortable. And she recommended, in her experience, a pilot's checklist is very thorough for the tasks that have multiple steps, because they don't ever want the pilot to have to think on their feet. They want it to be able to just look at it. Well, they do want them to think on their feet, but they also want to have that backup checklist. So she said for her and for people like her, having a pilot's checklist for things that you can do would be helpful. The pilot buddy program that matches neurodiverse and neurotypical employees can be very, very helpful. And then lastly are some resources. Again, you'll get a copy of the presentation, so the links are here. But these are just a few that have tremendous resources, tips, tools, checklists, things that you can pull right down and begin to apply. They also have, some of these have connections to job coaches, which could be a reasonable accommodation for someone who just needs a little bit of support there. So with that, let's see, we have just a couple more here. Are there any other questions we haven't answered? It looks like we've got them all. Mm-hmm. We've got them all. So we just want to thank everybody for taking the time to out of your busy days to hear a little bit more about this topic. And we certainly want to leave you with the thought that, neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race's biodiversity as in life in general. If you think about this and leave this and put it on your screen, look at it every day, who can say what form of wiring be best at any given moment? So why not expand the pool and be prepared with the best thinking at any given moment. With that, thank you, everybody. We welcome your follow-up questions. We hope to see you on a future webinar. Romaine, thank you as always for partnering with me on that.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Great. And we hope you all have a great day.
Have a
Thank
great day, everyone. Bye-bye.